I'm happy to welcome Ben Dixon back to the show. You've been a guest before. I think we first met when I was highlighting authors who are from Leicestershire, which is the gorgeous county here in the Midlands of England where I live. And you were the author back then of just the Neil Peel book series. But now I'm happy to have you back to talk about your latest book, Vengeance and Honor. So, welcome to the show, Ben.
Yeah, thank you for having me again, Tiffany. Pleasure to speak to you.
People who have followed the show for a while will also remember that you came on earlier this year to talk about writing books and particularly kind of the difference between traditional publishing and self-publishing, and you had some really great advice for that. So I'll make sure I put the link to both of our previous interviews in the notes for this episode. But I've been trying to go out of my way to feature independently published books this year. I think this is a very exciting genre. And while some people are really doomer about the future of publishing, they're saying AI is just going to take over all of it and we're all just going to be reading slop. I think there actually is hunger for real authentic books, especially outside the kind of walled garden of traditional publishing where you have to go through these silos of people who have very particular opinions about what books should be. And I think you can just do more fun and interesting stuff outside of all that. Of course, traditional publishing is great for some people. Why don't you start out by reminding us all a little bit about yourself and how you got started with writing?
Like you said, I did. I wrote a trilogy of teen humor. I suppose you would be the category. There isn't really a category for my first three books. The books about this boy called Neil Peel who always tells the truth. I wrote them sort of in the style of Adrian Mole, which is I think how we came to meet because of Sue Townsend writing the Adrian Mole books, and she was a Leicestershire author as well. And I was trying to hit the appeal that she managed to enthuse in everybody back in the 80s when she wrote those books first of all, and they were so popular, but they didn't really. Once she'd finished and Adrian had grown up, nobody ever really took that on, particularly perhaps from a boy's point of view. So I tried to write books that would entertain and that were perhaps particularly appealing to boys, but not really just to boys, but children who had gone beyond the David Walliams age books, and perhaps wanted something a bit more at their level. So yeah, that's how I came into writing, and then I loved writing those books, but of course the story comes to an end, or it did for me, and I finished three of them, the trilogy, and it wrapped up in a very nice place for Neil, I thought. And so yeah, that was where that came to a natural stopping point, natural conclusion. And so then I had to look for another genre to write rather than carry on and doing more of the same.
What made you pick fantasy, sort of sword and sorcery, fantasy adventure? Because that is different. I can see a lot of the same sense of humor in Vengeance and Honor, the kind of, you're not afraid to get a bit earthy. Nothing that's like completely, parents aren't going to freak out about it or anything. But the kind of stuff that teenagers will giggle at, or I will admit, grown adults, you know. But what made you go, oh, well, I've enjoyed writing teen comedy, but now I want to switch to fantasy? And have you been into this genre for a long time, or did you discover it as an adult?
Well, I did think as soon as I'd finished, well, where do I go from here? When I'd finished the Neil Peel books, the Neil Peel books, all the way through, Neil and his friends were playing a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And that's something that had always interested me. And it made me think back to the fighting fantasy choose your own adventure books that I used to enjoy as a probably 12 to 16 and maybe a little bit older as well. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but you read a little bit, then you choose where your adventurer is going to go, or what he's going to do, who he's going to fight. And I had those Warlock of Firetop Mountain and Citadel of Chaos books, and I used to love those. I suppose they were good for people who didn't want to read a whole novel because you were just reading a chunk at a time, and then you can leave your bookmark in and pick up the adventure later on. But they're very interactive. And I suppose I used to play a lot of board games like that, Hero Quest and Dungeons and Dragons itself, of course, the big one. Um, and that's always been something I have been interested in, but I'd never really thought that I could write it. But it was certainly a genre I thought, okay, I'll have a look at this. And I never really set pen to paper until I've mulled ideas around in my mind for long enough that I think, okay, there's a grain of something here that I could plant and see how it goes. And I eventually found just that grain of an idea that gave me enough to start thinking, okay, I'll pursue this and make some notes and see how the story grows from there.
It's funny that you mentioned the choose your own adventure books. I used to read a lot of those in elementary school and then kind of up through junior high. There's a series that's actually called Choose Your Own Adventure. And those were very much a stock book in school cupboards. Like, your teacher would have a bunch. And now that you mention it, I can see the influence of that in this book. Because like now looking back, I'm like, oh, I can think back to a few moments where it's almost like, you're playing a video game or something and you can see the option menu pop above the character's head and it's like option A, do this, option B, do that. And I mean that in a good way where it kind of captures the fun of making those choices in the moment. And I do feel like the characters in your story, you can see them thinking out their options and making choices and then you're wondering, "Oh, what are they going to do next?" which is more fun because it's really no fun when you read a story and you know exactly what the character's going to do ahead of time.
A lot of fantasy books are, as readers will know, are extremely thick. And there's an awful lot of description, but in these choose your own adventure ones, it's fairly action packed. And there may be a little bit of do you go east or west and travel in that direction, but then you meet another person, there's another encounter. And I think that I tried to make mine very accessible to people who don't have the greatest attention span, whilst also making it interesting for those who do and want to see how the characters develop.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about Vengeance and Honor? Don't spoil it, of course. That's why I'm going to have you do it and not me, because I don't want to get in trouble for spoiling anything that you don't want out there. But yeah, tell us a little bit about this book and the sort of adventure that it goes on.
It starts off like all good quests do in a tavern. There is a hooded figure walking into the tavern, and that is Hendel. He's a half elf who is going to become one of the main characters. There is an unpleasant scene in there, but in that scene, he meets Rick, who is a former knight, and the two form a brief friendship. The former knight, Rick's girlfriend, who works in the tavern, gets kidnapped, and then the two of them head off on a quest to try and get her back. They are joined by two others along the way who help them. And the title, Vengeance and Honor, the vengeance part is Rick wanting vengeance for the fact that his love has been taken away. And the honor part that runs all through it really is what's the honorable thing to do. Now, Rick used to be a knight who lived in the kingdom. His father was the king. He doesn't want to be a prince anymore. He didn't want the role of all the things that went along with the role of being a prince. So his honor is in question. Should he have stayed and been the honorable knight? But it wasn't for him. He didn't want it. And he's always questioning what is the honorable thing to do in his way to get back his girlfriend, May, who is taken away from him at the beginning. And yes, it's, I hope, an entertaining, it's fast paced. I hope it's amusing at times as well. I hope it's exciting in that dangerous way. So I think there's peril, there's magic, lots of things going on along this adventure. And yeah, it's a quest natured book that I hope lots of people will be able to get behind and enjoy.
I really enjoyed it, and I have to say, like I've never played well, I play video game RPGs, but like I've never played tabletop or anything like that. So I'm not deep in this genre or anything, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought the pace moved along nicely and that this is going to be a good book for kind of older teenagers and up. And I think it's a great example of telling a story exactly the way you want to tell it and having the liberty to do that through self-publishing. So when you were writing it, quite a lot of fantasy stories focus on this kind of like ragtag band of adventurers. And I think a lot of that is rooted in the fact that most people point to J.R.R. Tolkien as the father of fantasy as we know it. It's not that there weren't fantasy type stories before him, but the fantasy genre really was born with like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which are very much stories about a ragtag band of adventurers from a whole bunch of different ethnicities and everything. And your story does follow that pattern. And I was curious to know what you thought about that. Like, is this just because it was in the original DNA of fantasy coming from Tolkien, or is there something about that pattern that just works especially well with fantasy genre?
You can have a loner, for instance, a Conan the Barbarian type story. He's the main character, and a lot of people like that. I'm not sure if you identify with the barbarian as such in modern human life, but I like to. I have my four main characters, and I would like to hope that there's perhaps something in at least one of them that can appeal to you as a reader, and maybe you'll identify a little bit with the choices that one of them is making. So I have. As a little introduction to it, the four main characters. There's a drunken former knight, Rick, who is just after a quiet life, and he's obviously human. And then there is a half elf called Hendel, who is searching for the human side of his parentage. He's half elf and half human. There is an archmage called Stefan and a cleric called Callista, and they all have, I hope, a different personality. Sometimes someone's personality will come to the fore and help them in a certain situation, whereas if someone else had been speaking up, it would be a disaster. Um, and yes, I like to hope that everyone would be able to think, I could identify with the one who thinks things through and speaks calmly, or I would be the one who blunders into something, or I'd be the one who find that funny because even when it's not appropriate. But they all mean well, and that's why they gel together as a group. I think the four of them. But yes, I think, like you say, in Tolkien, you can either look to the nobility of Aragorn, or the amazing skills of Legolas, or the grumpy nature of Gimli, or the simple Shire folk. And they're all likable in their own way. And when you put them together as a group, they band together and root for each other, fight for each other. And there's that nobility of they would die for their friends is something I certainly emulated and probably stole from Tolkien. But you're right. I think there's that ragtag group of people who you wouldn't necessarily throw together. Circumstances put them together, and I hope that that came across well in what I wrote.
I know it's like asking you to pick your favorite kid, but out of the characters in your book, which one is your favorite? If you can pick one.
Well, I don't know. I suppose I have a very soft spot for Stefan. As someone who knew about Neil Peel, Neil Peel's best friend was called Stephen, and he was a red-haired, curly red-haired character. And the archmage in this is Stefan, and he's a curly red-haired character. And in fact, that Stefan was the name of the character Stephen played in his D&D quest. So I borrowed my own characters in a way and stole that. But yeah, they all have a. I like writing all of them because I like the fact that Rick, who is the former knight, is a drunkard and is always battling with his uh, love of ale, and but he's also got deep roots in honor and what he should and shouldn't do. Um, and Hendel is a stand-up guy. He like elves, I think, tend to be written. They are perhaps less fun, but they are clear thinkers. And then Callista is probably the wisest of them all, who leads them along the right path and has strong morals of what you should do, even when the others want to follow the path that we're supposed to be going down. She will say, "But no, this is the right thing to do. We have to do it." Um, so, yeah, but I think Stefan, because he's always looking for fun, um, it was probably my favorite to write because I could get away with saying very silly things through his mouth.
I have to say, I related a little bit to Rick. As you said, he doesn't necessarily have the best self-control. Um, like he knows what he should do, and then he doesn't always do it. And that's a flaw. I think everyone can relate to that. But lately, I've just been like, why did I stay up so late? Or why didn't I do this? I really meant to get this done today. And so his flaws seemed pretty relatable to me as well. Now, you had characters in this book with magical abilities, and when you write characters with magical abilities, I have read stories where either just the rules about the magic were very inconsistent or poorly thought out, or the character just has too much power. Like, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Superman, which is obviously not fantasy, but Superman isn't that different from, say, like a mage in that he has these unbelievable powers, and people often complain that Superman is overpowered, so he's uninteresting. And you can also get that with characters in fantasy who have magical abilities and they're just not interesting because they're either so overpowered or their powers are so inconsistent that they're kind of meaningless. So, how did you approach that and plan ahead? Because you very clearly avoided the things that I hate about characters with magical abilities.
Stefan is he's very powerful, but he's also quite young. So there is, I think, still some room for him to grow. He's desperately excited to be part of a quest and be able to use his powers, but he hasn't tested them out fully against enemies by this point. So he, I think, grows through making a few mistakes as the book goes along to realize when is the right time to use certain powers and well, how you learn from using the wrong ones. Are you selfish and look after yourself, or do you use your magic to help others? Callista likewise is very caring. She's a cleric, so she's a healer and worships a goddess of motherhood, and so her battles would be how to use those powers to attack when she's really more of a defense and healing and nurturing type of a person. So they had um, their internal battles of how to use their magic, and I think certainly Stefan, because he was that little bit younger, was growing throughout the book. Yeah, so I didn't give them those all powerful spells and powers right away.
Yeah, so both limits in terms of ability as well as their personalities and understanding.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I mean, I followed very closely, without wanting to name the very famous game that I've already mentioned earlier on. The spells that are available to those types of characters, um, without using their terminology, so that if people are very keen followers of that type of quest-based role-playing game, then they might recognize and be familiar with some of the spells that are available there, and they wouldn't be able to come at me and say, "But an archmage can't do that because that's a sorcerer's spell." So I think I've tried to stick to the accepted law of what is available, but yes, not overpower them too early.
There are a couple of creative spells. I won't give away the one that was most surprising to me because it happens toward the end. Callista deploys the most unusual bit of magic that I've ever seen. It's weird and sweet and very awkward. And I think that captured some of the awkwardness in the Neil Peel books too. That last moment at the end. I won't spoil it, so we'll let readers discover that awkwardness for themselves. But the thing about that moment where she uses this magic in a way to help some people, I did think it was interesting because she was definitely using her role as a healer, but it wasn't like, just out of nowhere. It wasn't ex nihilo type magic. It was very direct and very facilitating. And so it did kind of show that there are rules to how the magic works. And I think that that's a good foundation for building any kind of fantasy world. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with tapping into the patterns that are already used widely across the genre. Like, it's not stealing at all. You're just kind of continuing to participate in this long tradition of both, like, the board games, RPGs, films. Like, people are familiar with these patterns and these patterns work, and there's nothing wrong with using them. It's not that you're using patterns, it's how you deploy them. That, like, it's the same thing as if you're, I don't know, making something out of cloth or building a house. You can put your own style into it, but there's nothing wrong with using good traditional engineering structures to make sure that it all works. In our previous conversation, you talked a lot about publishing and the process of writing. And I was wondering if you had any specific advice for people who wanted to write fantasy. Like, are there things that you did differently when writing this book as opposed to writing in the comedy genre, as far as thinking through your story, structuring it? Did you do lots of planning? Did you do wild and crazy drafts? Like, what's your advice and how did it go for you?
I think one of the big differences was that this is a hugely established genre already. So if you are to have something new and different and interesting to say, that takes a lot more work than the teen humor genre, which I had free reign to do whatever I wanted there because I wasn't really going to be treading on anybody's toes. And I think with fantasy, if you've read a lot of fantasy, it must be very hard not to imitate what has been done already before. And I haven't read very widely in the fantasy genre recently. I mean, I've read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and these fighting fantasy things and Game of Thrones, all of those books. But they're a different. Well, actually, the Lord of the Rings Hobbit was something a little similar. I imitated them in a way that I've got this quest, but that's kind of world threatening stuff, whereas mine is much more personal. So finding your own unique story is the biggest challenge. And when I thought I could write in sword and sorcery, fight and fantasy, I hesitated for a while until I thought I'd got a good enough story, a good enough arc, interesting enough characters that I could take that grain of an idea and grow it into something bigger. So I would caution taking time to think about it. And some people say just get on with it, start writing, but it wasn't until I thought it would be worth it. So I would say if you are thinking of starting out, make sure your characters are people you want to find out about, and make sure your story is something you would like to read. And that's the good thing about independent publishing is that I could write exactly what I wanted to, and I could. You may remember I'm sure it's hard to forget the group bathing scene after there's a particularly sweaty and bloody, violent episode, and everybody is dirty and sweaty afterwards. And I don't imagine in many traditionally published novels I'd have been able to get away with them all bathing in the stream and the accompanying spell that goes with that I was allowed to because I'm in charge of what I'm putting in there.
Yeah, I can't imagine that something like that would be allowed given that sensitivity readers are now the czars of publishing. But then it's also one of the more memorable parts of the book. And it's exactly the sort of thing that is going to appeal to like a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, which is, I think, about the age that I would recommend for this book. It's kind of like 16 and up. I mean, there might be a few a bit younger that would be interested and ready for it. I think you get much younger than that. Those sorts of scenes will just be like, the kids will just be like, ah, I can't, I can't, I can't. Whereas if you get to the older teens, they're ready to have a good laugh at that kind of thing.
That's interesting because people have said who is it aimed at, assuming it's still going to be aimed at the teen readers, the audience I was reaching the first time. Although it seems that more adults got more of the jokes in the Neil Peel books than the teens did. Again, talking about Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I would say that they are almost out of an age bracket because they're read by 10 or 11-year-olds who are mature enough to handle the writing style, but they're loved by adults as well. And I wanted to aim at that. So I know that perhaps some of maybe a little bit of nudity that we just spoke about there, which is unsuitable for the younger readers. But I wanted it to appeal to adults and also to teens. And I suppose violence is as graphic as your imagination makes it. There isn't so much sex in mine, but there is a bit of nudity, and that perhaps makes it, as you say, not quite so suitable for the younger readers. But I did want it not to be just for adults or just for children, teen audience, and I hope that I've managed to do that just about.
Good books can be read by anyone, right? Like, so many adults read children's books over and over and come back to them again and again because, like you said, with the Neil Peel books, a lot of adults were getting jokes that the kids weren't. And that's the fun part is, you experience things as a kid and then you come back and re-experience them as an adult and you find things that you didn't pick up on before and then you laugh extra hard because you remember your naive, youthful reaction to it. Like, I don't know if you ever saw any of the old Shelley Duvall fairy tale theater films that she did. These were big, like when I was little. We used to get them on we used to get them on VHS at the video store. And I've been rewatching some of them just to kind of dig for ideas and look for things. And there are so many jokes in there where I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's a bit cheeky, but like, 6, 7 year old me, it was just right over my head, right? But then I'm laughing extra hard because I realize what I thought it was when I was a kid. And then now I understand what it actually is as an adult. So yeah, these things, they're for everyone. They're for all ages. And if you're writing it correctly, you will experience the same story on different levels. What are you working on now, and how can people find you online?
Well, I'm working on the sequel. I'm about halfway through the sequel to this. I hope I don't like leaving books that don't wrap up very nicely. So I hope that if people get to the end of Vengeance and Honor, they will find that it wraps up the story nicely, but then there is room to go forward. And I am really excited about a lot of what I've written, particularly perhaps in Stefan's journey and Hendel's journey as we move forward into the next book. I think the idea is it will be a trilogy. That's what I've got planned. So yes, I'm working on that. I don't think it's going to be out in time for Christmas, though. Even though I do tend to speed up near the end, yes, it won't quite be ready. But if people do read the first one and enjoy it, it shouldn't be too long until the sequel comes out, which I do have a title, but I'm not quite ready to share it yet. People can find me online at Ben Dixon Author on Instagram is probably the easiest, the best place. I do have a neilpeel.com website. And although it's called neilpeel.com, I do put a little bit about Vengeance and Honor and the fantasy ones on there. And all 4 books I've written are on Amazon. And the first one, The Heroic Truths of Neil Peel, is also online at Waterstones, Barnes and Noble, and all around.
Fantastic. And I'd say if anyone's looking for a Christmas book for a teenager, you know, boys, girls who like adventure, anyone who likes a good laugh, I would recommend all 4 books by Ben Dixon. And thanks so much for joining me again, Ben. And I hope to hear from you soon when you've got another installation in your fantasy trio.
Well, pleasure talking with you as usual, Tiffany.
Oh, thanks very much.